into Vietnam tomorrow. We may have to wrap up with a little bit of Kennedy's administration tomorrow. But otherwise, we should pretty much be there. Okay? All right. So when we look at Eisenhower's administration, what you have to understand and realize is that, yes, we are going back in time. Because as we go back in, or as we're looking at this, right, and if you think about it, we just got done talking about the Civil Rights Movement. And what period did we say the Civil Rights Movement existed in?
The 50s to the 60s.
1968. Good job, okay? So, yeah, 1950 to 1968. So if we're talking 1950 to 1968, we have more than one president during that time frame, right? In fact, we have how many?
3, 4,
4. How many? Which ones?
Eisenhower.
Yeah, Eisenhower.
JFK.
JFK.
LBJ.
LBJ, and who's before Eisenhower?
FDR.
Truman. Okay, Truman. So we have 4 presidents during the course of the Civil Rights Movement, right? So we've talked about the Civil Rights Movement, but understand that we now need to go back to talk a little bit about 2 of those presidents, 3 of those presidents, right? Because we need to talk about Johnson a little bit too, but Johnson will largely be talked about during the course of the Vietnam rather than during this section here. So we're going to talk about Eisenhower a little bit, and then we'll get into Mr. Kennedy. Now, Eisenhower very much personifies like the 1950s quintessential person. When Truman decides not to run for re-election in 1952, Eisenhower has a pretty clear path to victory in that presidential election. You have to realize that Eisenhower is a war hero, right? What we know him best at this point because he's the dude that was in command of
Allied forces.
The Allied forces, right? And the invasion of Normandy. So he's a World War II hero, right? And as a result of that, he's able to get that landslide victory. But there's something else that's key about his administration and his run and bid for office. He will, like all presidents from this point on, will utilize television to help his campaign strategy. Now, it's not used with televised debates, as we'll see in the 1960 election, but it is used with campaign ads, and so we can see the importance of campaign ads beginning as early as the 1952 election. Oh, sorry, go back. And again, he'll use it in the 1956 presidential election.
Everybody likes I for president. Hang up the banner and beat the drum. We'll say thank you, Washington. We don't want John or Harry. Let's do that big jump right. Let's get in step with the guy that's left. Get in step with I. You like I like I. Everybody likes I for president. Hang up the banner and beat the drum. We'll say thank you, Washington. We have to get where we are going. Now all day and night for president. And they go the other way. We'll all go with I.
Okay, I would argue that I would like to see this kind of political campaign ad much more than what we currently have on television, that it would be a lot more interesting and a lot more positive spin. But yeah, Ike becomes, or Eisenhower, but he is known as Ike for short. He very much is typical of that 1950s individual, but also very much Americans can relate to him, and they see him as kind of being just another one of them. Yes?
What was his vice president's name?
Good question. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Is it somebody, is it Michael, perhaps? So it was Mike and Ike?
Oh, gee.
That would be pretty funny, but I don't think so. But that would be great. But he wins in a landslide victory. Now, we've already talked about a lot of the civil rights legislation. We see in his presidencies that his 2 terms in office that Plessy v. Ferguson is overturned. We see the public schools being integrated through Little Rock 9, Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, the rise of Martin Luther King Jr., right? So we are seeing a great deal of sweeping legislative change during the civil rights movement that occurs in his presidency. Now, it is not until the presidency of Johnson, though, that we'll see the passage of the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and subsequent, or 65 is the Voting Rights, 1964 is the Civil Rights Act. When it comes to his foreign policy with the Cold War, it is under his presidency that we will see that America will use the policy of brinkmanship, which basically means that we will do what it takes and will push everybody to the brink of war, but that largely those countries won't actually declare war on the United States because the United States is more powerful, that we have more nuclear weapons, and so as a result of that, they won't use that. We'll also see within his presidency the use of massive retaliation, that we'll use that as a deterrent for actually going into any kind of nuclear war. Now, the reality of that is that it basically brings us to the point of war, and at sometimes it's often even referred to as MAD, that massive retaliation, because you'd have to be mad in order to use those nuclear weapons. Now, it is also within his presidency when he's just coming in, so when he's been elected as lame duck and coming into the White House, that the Korean War will end. It's under his presidency that the Soviets are able to launch Sputnik. What was Sputnik?
The
The first satellite in space. Why is that a big deal? Lindsay, heads up. Why is Sputnik a big deal?
Because America's falling behind.
Yeah, because it represents that America could be falling behind the Soviets, and if the Soviets can launch a satellite into space, they can do what with that satellite? They can spy on us. What else could they do, Case?
Shoot missiles from it.
Yeah, they could shoot missiles from it, or hey, you know what, if you can launch, Lindsay, if you can launch a satellite into space, what prevents you from using that technology to launch a nuclear warhead into space and then allow that to come back down into the United States as a whole? So it brings the United States to this point of a great deal of fear over what could happen if we don't also start to beef up our program as well. In addition to that, it is under his administration that we see the crash during the Paris peace conferences between us and the Soviet Union, which were meant to de-escalate the Cold War, that a U.S. spy plane, the U-2, will actually crash land in Soviet territory. The problem with that crash landing is that Eisenhower refuses to admit that it's actually a spy plane. Okay, and in fact he talks about it and says, no, was a weather balloon. Okay, but then the Soviets produced the pilot. Weather balloon, here's your pilot, do you want him back? So Eisenhower is forced to admit that yes, in fact, we were actually spying on the Soviets, and our peace talks between us and the Soviets fall apart, and it leads to an escalation between us and the Soviet Union, not a de-escalation. Now, to be fair, the Soviets were spying on us at the same time. It just happened to be that our plane happened to crash, and our pilot got captured, and so Eisenhower then lying about it and made him look bad, right? So unfortunately, it caused those talks to wear down. When it comes to his domestic policy, largely his domestic policy pushed him to create what he called an affluent society. Now, he believed very much in creating and helping to create what David Potter called a people of plenty. And so his economic policies were largely designed into allowing for that economic growth, which included allowing for greater purchase of goods on credit and allowing then for the surplus of commodity of good that Americans were able to make to be able to be sent overseas into third world countries. That consumerism is very much represented in the fact that Americans are largely shopping now at large shopping malls, and Americans more often than not were now two-car instead of single-car homes. So while dad is off at work, mom can run her errands that she needs to and take the kids to their sporting events and whatnot. Because remember, that is mom's role in the 1950s, is to be the chauffeur, the caretaker. But that consumption in America leads to this ideal that you wanted to have more than the next guy. And so pretty much everything had some allure of that affluent society and would show where you were ranked within our society as a whole. More colored appliances were the more desirable appliances because it cost more in order to produce. Much like today, the white appliance is less desirable than, say, your new fancy-dancy stainless steel appliances in your homes, okay? Even cars become a symbol of that affluent society. Rather than the Ford being the car for every man, it was now the car for the poor man. And the car that everybody aspired to be able to drive was the Cadillac. Now that, I would argue, still exists in American society today as well. The car very much is a status symbol for Americans. If you're somebody who's wealthy and wants to show off that wealthy status, what kind of vehicle are you driving?
Lamborghini.
A Lamborghini, a what? A Lincoln, a Suburban?
A 1992 Honda Accord.
Okay, I don't know if I would say a Suburban. I would probably go the route, if you're thinking of a larger vehicle, like maybe like a Lincoln Navigator, or like for a while when the Hummer was like a big deal to get a Hummer, right? If you had an SUV. But yeah, a Mustang. Still though, the Mustang is an interesting one because it's a Ford, right? But it's still a symbol of greater prosperity within Ford by being able to drive a Mustang versus being able to drive a Ford Taurus, right? Okay? So there is still that status symbol that comes with the American automotive industry even today. Now, with the growth of that American automotive industry and the growth of American industry as a whole, Eisenhower needed to deal with that consumption level by trying to maintain the expenditures, and so he keeps inflation low by controlling what the federal government is spending. And in the 1950s, he's largely able to balance the budget despite the fact that there is spending being done by the federal government. Most of that spending goes with federal works projects, such as our American highway system, which was largely built in the 1950s. Now, Eisenhower built that interstate highway system as a means of economic and security during the course of the Cold War. Had a nuclear weapon been detonated, he argued that the highway system would allow for the quick and rapid transportation not only of troops, but also of planes, as well as the possibility of having to export people out of a particular area. That's why the vast majority of interstate highway systems are as straight as possible, and why there is legally a set amount of space that must be between two overpasses. It is large enough to allow for a plane to land. It also explains why that even in the state of North Dakota, it's part of the explanation as to why our interstates are straight, and they've got very long stretches of straight because of having a nuclear base up in Minot, okay? But it becomes important for that national defense, but it also allows to facilitate jobs, allows for the improvement of the trucking industry, which allows for products to be easily shipped across the United States, okay? Within his affluent society and his domestic programs, including his Great Society programs, the reality of it is despite that balanced budget, the United States is creating greater supports in other areas. Amongst in that Great Society program, he argued for what he calls dynamic conservatism. And he argued that we needed to maintain some of the ideals of the New Deal, including he called for extended Social Security rights, as well as he also called for an increase in a minimum wage to, wait for it, $1 an hour. Okay, as a federal minimum wage.
What was it before?
What's that?
What was it before?
I don't remember what it was before, but it wasn't very much, okay? But yeah, $1 an hour is a federal minimum wage. In addition to that, he also used his rights as president pretty frequently within that concept of dynamic conservatism, in that he was actually vetoed congressional bills 169 only overridden by Congress twice. So he really will use that office of the presidency to help create that expansion that he felt was necessary. He will also create in 1953 the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare as part of that, which he argued was going to oversee the progress and the continued expansion of the New Deal programs. He also used what's called eminent domain to allow for the expansion and building of water canals under the Army Corps of Engineers. And under this then, he was able to turn billions of acres into farmland that was once desert. We were able to divert rivers, including within the St. Lawrence Seaway, to redesign our structure in order for it to fit us and our needs. It allows for the economic growth in areas such as Southern California, Arizona, and Texas because of the water being diverged to that region. But it also meant that small farmers often lost land that they had. In addition to that, American Indians often lost land as their land was flooded by reservoirs, as these reservoirs were built across the United States. There are even some areas, there's one area, if I remember correctly, I think it's either in Southern California or just barely into Nevada, but it's, actually I'm almost positive it's in Southern California. But this land, actually, this place used to be a decently populated area, but when they started building these reservoirs, they had to flood cities, so they would actually move people out of them. So it's really interesting. You can actually still see the buildings and stuff underwater. Like if you were to go and scuba dive, you can see the buildings that remain there. And basically, it's like a little town that's just underwater. It's kind of cool. But in order to ensure that growth within our society and ensure growth in crops, we also begin using pesticides in order to combat a lot of that, the pests and increase productivity. And so as a result, pesticides such as DDT and herbicides as well to kill the weeds were often present in most of our foods that we began consuming as Americans. Individuals like Rachel Carlson will write in Silent Spring that it is those pesticides that will cause us huge ecological problems, not only to Americans, but to insect population, which needs to be able to eat, and then that cross-pollination is actually very helpful for plants, not a hindrance, and so we shouldn't actually kill the insects. We should leave them be rather than trying to get rid of them. The United States will also see almost a third Great Awakening during this time frame, in which church membership will almost double. We can see this increase in church membership and increase in commitment to the church because the traditional separation of church and state begins to blur. We see this both on our monetary system as well as in the Pledge of Allegiance. The Pledge of Allegiance, which was first written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy, in 1954 has the words "under God" added to the Pledge of Allegiance. So when people get so uptight over the Pledge of Allegiance being said in schools because it has the words "under God" in there, well, then let's just take the "under God" out, because it hasn't always been in our Pledge of Allegiance anyways, and we'll just go with that. But it does represent very much the United States going back towards religion. The other thing, too, is we see officially then in 1956, "In God We Trust" becomes our national motto, and then is put on our monetary system. It actually first appears on our money in 1861, but it doesn't become a permanent element of our currency until 1956. Eisenhower encouraged Americans to pursue their own religious creed, and he argued that the government still, even if you had freedom of religion, that the government operated under the ideals of faith. He argues that all legal systems comprise and come from those ideals of faith anyways, and so the incorporation of the Christian faith into our society was not that out of the norm because of the fact that that's where the basis in our legal system is in the Ten Commandments. So that religious intensity grows also because many of those religious leaders have celebrity status. Bishop Fulton Sheen, which is this dude right here, he actually is an Emmy Award winner from his television, I hate that word. Televised church, but the TV, it's televangelical, something. Thank you. God, I don't know why that doesn't come out of my brain right. Okay, Vincent Norman Peale was an award-winning author, and he wrote his books. A series of books was called The Power of Positive Thinking. Billy Graham, which is this dude right here, he's also a very popular guy, and he called for the peace with God amongst all peoples. So, but Billy Graham is probably one of the most well-known of all of them, and of course Martin Luther King Jr., where you have to remember that initially and in his foundations he's a pastor, right? So I mean that's where he gains his or grows from to begin with. When it comes to his foreign policy, after the Korean War, Eisenhower will push for the release of approximately, the release of POWs. But unfortunately for Eisenhower, many of those POWs never even come home. He also calls for the reduction of tensions between us and the Soviets, but largely that fails as well. He calls for the CIA to take on a new look or a new strategic goal, and calls for them to do even more covert actions. It is under those covert actions then that we see him become involved in numerous areas across the globe. This includes in Taiwan, in which a crisis in which the communist China tried to seize Taiwan and to control that, and the U.S. basically warned that any attack by the Chinese on Taiwan would result in the United States using our full naval forces, as well as the possibility of us using our nuclear weaponry in order to remove the Chinese from Taiwan. In the Middle East, the Suez Canal, Eisenhower will step in on the aid of the Egyptians, as we try to help them finance the creation of that. It is under that idea then that despite the United States in our intervention in there, that many of the people of the Arab world will actually turn to themselves rather than turning to outside forces as a result of the fear that the United States would come in and control and dominate in that. Our efforts in Egypt both anger both the British and the French, but also uses the United Nations commitment to non-violence to help end and deal with any kind of conflict that may exist in the world. It also leads us into our involvement in Iran, in which the United States will basically allow for the overthrow of the Shah of Iran in order to put in a pro-U.S. state in there. But unfortunately for them, the person that we put in place basically becomes a dictator, and largely will lead to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, in which later on then 50 U.S. hostages will be taken at that for a total of 444 days. So if you think about our involvement in the Middle East, our involvement in the Middle East largely will begin in a post-World War II era, beginning as early as 1948 with the creation of the Israeli state, and the United States really has never left that area. In addition to that, the United States will support other non-communist regimes, pro-American regimes in other areas as well, including in Guatemala, in which the United States will use CIA operatives to help to overthrow Jacobo Guzman, who was elected as president of Guatemala under communist support, and we are able to then put somebody else in there. Now that's largely, our efforts in Guatemala are largely fueled by the United States Fruit Company, out of Boston, which owned 500,000 acres in Guatemala and were requesting the aid of the United States in order to ensure that communism didn't spread there and thus remove their ability to profit from their fruit in Guatemala. Okay? But that largely leads to what's called Yankee phobia in Latin America, where many of the Latin American states begin to look once again as the United States as that colossus of the North that in that relationship that we had with them during the imperialist era. Okay, so but it's not until Nixon becomes president that he'll actually go on like a goodwill tour of Latin America to try to kind of ease some of those tensions. But unfortunately, it doesn't ease those tensions. It just in ways increases them. And then, of course, we have his efforts in Vietnam, which we will talk about tomorrow. Okay. In addition to that, it is under his administration that we will see the launch of Sputnik. And the Soviets, after launching Sputnik, will say that we will bury you and your grandchildren will live under communism. In that one single stroke, that one single act, Americans begin to pour and are willing to do whatever it takes in order to create security once again and to be able to dominate the Russians. And it is largely what will lead to our space program under Kennedy. Now, at the time that Sputnik is launched, it is at the end of Johnson's administration, or I'm sorry, Eisenhower's administration. And Eisenhower has seen over the course of his presidency that the military has grown in strength rather than being reduced in strength. And so he calls and he's really worried about American spending in the military. Because he basically argues is what you're going to create is what he calls in his farewell speech, he says that it would be a military-industrial complex. Basically, the United States always has to be engaged in war, because if we're not engaged in war, economically we would lose so much profit that our economy would simply fall apart. And he warns that by creating that military-industrial complex, that it would continually pull the United States into world affairs and foreign affairs that would ultimately lead more to our downfall than to our benefit. And he worries about the amount that the U.S. is spending. He says that he wishes that I could see a lasting peace in sight, but he argues that because of that military-industrial complex, that peace will never come, that it will always be basically some sort of war somewhere. And arguably, is he right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you look, I mean, this is our spending in 2008, right? And you look at the amount that the United States spends militarily in comparison to the rest of the world. And I get this is 2008, so this is 8 years old, but it really hasn't changed that much with number-wise. The United States is still the biggest spender on military support services. We actually spend more on our military every year than we do on any other program in the United States. So, if you were Eisenhower, you would argue that this would be incorrectly. But he basically says that this is what happens with the military-industrial complex. That because of, you have, in order to make this system work with the defense contractors, you have these individuals who they're going to give campaign contributions, which will allow for TV, radio, and whatnot, to ensure that those individuals will be the ones who are elected, or who influence the voters, who elect individuals, who run the Armed Services Committee, who send lobbyists, which are part of these defense contractors, and then it basically becomes a revolving door of people to ensure that the defense industry makes money. So, this argument isn't a new one to our history. When was the last time we used this argument that military brought us into something? Do you remember who said that? He was from North Dakota. After World War I.
Gerald Nye?
Yeah, Gerald P. Nye, right? He argues that it is that military and the military contractor that brought us into World War I and will bring us into future wars. That's why we became more isolationist and used our isolationist policies, leading us up into World War II. Eisenhower says that that will stay with us unless we are willing to change it. In 1960, then, the Republican Party will nominate Richard Nixon. Nixon had served as, this is not Nixon, by the way. Nixon had served as in the Naval Reserves. He had been an active vice president. In addition to that, he had also been an active defender of capitalism. For the Democratic Party, then, they will nominate John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson as his running mate. Lyndon Baines Johnson had previously been the Senate Majority Leader. And Kennedy, too, was also a veteran of World War II. He was served on a PT boat in the Pacific and was actually taken prisoner by the Japanese a while back. But he is young, a very charismatic dude, very handsome individual. He, unfortunately, though, was Catholic. But he's young, he's only 43 years old, and many people were worried that his religious beliefs would make him a poor candidate. In fact, it actually cost, the fact that he is a Catholic, cost him 1.5 million votes estimated, just because of the fact that he's Catholic. Okay? But while serving on that PT boat, he actually helps to rescue several of his crewmates and swam to another individual to try to rescue him, but that individual actually drowned. So he is a decorated war hero at that, and been a part of that Marine Corps within that. As a politician, he had 14 years of experience in the U.S. House of Representatives and as a senator. He is a pretty well-known family man. He had a young family. In fact, was one of a few presidents that actually had young children in the White House, very young children in the White House. And in fact, their third child actually dies. But he does have a very young family, and it is that young family in part that kind of draws people in, and his relationship with his children is pretty crucial there. Also, Americans can see a lot of him or a lot of themselves in him, even within his relationship with his wife, Jackie Kennedy. Becomes Jackie Kennedy Onassis later. And she then becomes almost as much important to the campaign as he is. Unlike previous presidents, what what she wore became crucial to his success. And so it's, I don't know. I want to argue it's a good thing that people are so concerned about what she wears, but it is definitely a key part of his campaign. Unlike previous presidential elections, as I said, the most decisive factor in the presidential election of 1960 would be the televised debates between him and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon refused to wear makeup, while Kennedy did, and so Nixon came across on screen as pale and sickly, whereas Kennedy came across as youthful, vibrant, and full of energy. And as a result of that, despite that verbally Nixon wins the debates, as is evident by the people who only listen to the debates on the radio, Kennedy is said to have won the debates because the vast majority of Americans saw the debates televised and did not listen to them on the radio. However, that being said, Kennedy wins, but not by a landslide majority. In fact, it's actually a really close race between him and Nixon, okay? But those on the radio largely will be more of the Midwestern states rather than the larger states, and so that he doesn't get as many votes from those regions as some of the others. So, as a result of that election, Kennedy will get 49.7 to Nixon's 49.5% of the votes. So it's a very close race. But he does get 100,000 more electoral votes, or not electoral votes, sorry. He is able to get 100 more approximately electoral votes, which allows him to be victorious in the race. Harry F. Byrd runs as an independent, but only gets minimal votes there. Some people argued that the election was actually stolen by Kennedy, that it was not a clear victory by Kennedy, and that it should have been more contested. They argued that there were some political machines that existed in Texas and Illinois that actually did not tally the votes correctly, and that they specifically actually tried to sway the voters towards voting for Kennedy. And on top of that, they actually sent in voters to vote on behalf of people who were dead in order to ensure a Kennedy victory in those two states. So it is kind of a little bit contested on that behalf, but yet Kennedy is declared as President of the United States. In his inaugural speech, he calls to the nation to lead, and argues that we are going to lead this generation into a new frontier. So again, right, we had what? Square deal, new deal, fair deal. Now we're going to new frontier as part of your plan. Great society under Johnson.